Well, I'll get started. It's 9 o'clock here in San Francisco, and good morning to folks in US, and good evening if you are in parts of Africa. And yeah, I guess it's a late evening for India. So wherever you are, so excited to see so many global practitioners coming to this webinar. It's one of the very popular series, and very excited and thankful for you to making this series successful altogether. This is really a conversation. This is a global conversations between all of us together who are really coming together to bring a better approach of scaling the social change. Today, I would like to welcome you to Lindsay Smalling from 60 Decibel. Lindsay, how are you?
Doing great. Beautiful day in San Francisco.
Excellent. So we both are actually in the Bay Area here. And again, my name is Unmesh Sheth, founder and CEO of SOCAP, and very much privileged to have Lindsay really presenting some of the very important topic, and it's actually near and dear to me personally, partly as part of the journey that we've been taking. The stakeholders' voice is a key to the success, and many of you who have joined our webinar series previously were the David Bond Bright, who really talked about stakeholder voice, and Jane Reisman and Veronica, who talked about standards. This is really a continuation of the previous series. To introduce you, all of you, by the way, just to as a housekeeping, please keep your introduction in chat window, and any questions for any of the panelists for 60 Decibel or SOPACT in Q&A sections, and we'll try to prioritize it and answer it as much as possible. Lindsay will talk about the topic. She will be spending most of the time giving very in-depth process and analysis on how to design very effective stakeholder survey. But at the end, we will keep 10 minutes or so aside, and this can continue if you have time beyond an hour as well. And wherever possible, we'll try to answer that in Q&A section. So please do upvote your answers and ask your questions ahead of time. So thank you so much. Again, this is the topic today is designing effective stakeholder survey to improve performance. So with that, today, Lindsay and I actually met at SOCAP. So Lindsay was actually, many of you may know, very popular social capital conference, one of the most popular conference in the social capital area called SOCAP. Happens every year since 2008, right, Lindsay?
Yep, that's right.
And it's really started as a conversations to bringing money and meaning and capital together. And she really was a CEO of SOCAP prior to 60 Decibel. Right now, currently, Lindsay is in the capacity of leading the head of sales, US sales, essentially. So I'm so happy and privileged to have her really talking about this thing. And there's a good reason why Lindsay is driving this topic. There's a when we talk about stakeholder survey or voice, 60 Decibel has done phenomenal work along with impact management projects, Keystone Accountability, and Social Value International. So we'll hear from her firsthand on how this really can be useful to you in designing those stakeholder voice altogether. So with that, I'm going to introduce a little bit about the series and who we are essentially. So this is a series, this is a very popular series that many people really come in, partly because it's designed to bring social change essentially. At SOPACT, we are committed to continuous stakeholder listening to the stakeholders and bring the social impact and scaling through the real outcome evidence process altogether. As we all know, as post-COVID, we all need to come together to build a sustainable world. And we are just one of the catalysts to drive these conversations between the impact practitioner communities altogether. So welcome to these conversations. And this is really a part of the conversations that started. And I will talk to you about why stakeholder voice or stakeholder survey is critical in the larger conversations of the impact management process altogether. We hope that with this series, we hope to accelerate the world's transition to being more sustainable and equitable. And finally, the new series will really focusing on the driving the conversations to improve the better outcome through continuous learning and improvement. As part of the series, we will have a next speaker, Jeremy Nichols. Many of you may already know them. He was a founder of Social Value International, an advisor to impact management projects and Capital Coalition altogether. So very excited about having Jeremy coming to us as the next webinar speaker on April 6th. So please do join that. Someone from SOCAP team will share that link with you as well. So again, please join that because Jeremy will talk about something very important, very different. As we all are very committed to impact measurement and management, the dialogue should go well beyond the tools and technology and the frameworks and standards altogether. There is a lot of key things that needs to be think through in terms of who owns the rules, who builds the rules of governing the impact management part of it. What is the relationship between asset owners and asset managers and assets? How should we properly define the impact? How should we build the field so that right impact management can be created from the ground up perspective altogether? And there are a lot of impediments to impact measurement management. As much as most people are interested in growing this space, he will talk about some of the challenges and really the ways to improve the impact management field. So really, please do tune in to the next webinar. Again, as I mentioned, the impact management is not just a buzzword. It's really a cross-sector partnership that can be shared to the definition of success and drive the accountability through the strong relationship and effective governance. And again, that's a topic of the next webinar. But what that means is that to effectively build this better impact management, we all need to come together. Impact Fund is to really define what is their role on reporting, what is their role of impact verification, how should they be building capacities of the enterprises whom they are funding, where should be channeling their dollars for financial and impact accounting is key to these conversations. And without building the capacities downwards, it's very difficult to scale this impact management space altogether. So really, it's important conversations that we need to drive together. It's important, obviously, in the process that stakeholder data collection is the key. In addition to many other things, the stakeholder data, because if you don't have a right questions that you ask to the stakeholder, we all agree the stakeholder is important. But the key thing is, how do we know that we are asking the right question? How do we know that we understand things through a holistic way? How do we know that we are really improving the results on a continuous basis altogether? And that is the key to the success. Obviously, many of you who are practitioners who are familiar with the things like RCT, randomized controlled trial, monitoring and evaluation, social return on investment, particularly continuous learning and improvement. It really is a process. It's a process that you continuously start with by listening to the stakeholders. You don't need to require any complex technology and tools. Essentially, start listening and learning from the stakeholders directly. But from there, you can build a very systematic approach that aligns with impact management projects, 5 dimensions of impact, so that you can understand the impact in better fashion. So I think Lindsay will give us a much deeper background on how to design effective survey that aligns with 5 dimensions of impact altogether. So really looking forward to that aspect of it. And this is the final slide that before I hand it over to Lindsay. This is important because this is the 5 key success factor of doing the right impact management. Number one is standardizing frameworks. And as you know, there are many, many players in the space, from impact management project to GIN to many, many standard bearers, IDs Plus to SDG and SASB, GRI. So many other players are really have been focusing on this thing for decades on these things. And good news is that frameworks like IDs Plus are bringing a lot of things together, but that framework itself is not sufficient, essentially. And that's where it comes down to really next step, which is the effective stakeholder survey. And without asking the right questions, you're gonna get garbage in, garbage out. And you will be surprised how often I have seen surveys being designed which are either too complex, too verbose, or are really asking the questions that does not inform the right intentionality of the impact. And so the real goal here that we are here presenting here with the 60 Decibel and SOCAP together is really creating a high quality, effective survey can really be key to the driving the impact. Now, that is very useful, but again, it has to be something embedded into your DNA. And that's why impact learning comes as the next important thing, which is really, in fact, stakeholder survey is not a one-time process. It's a continuous longitudinal-based approach where you continuously hear it, make sure the surveys are not too big, but make sure that it's very effective and make sure you're continuously listening. And that is the key. And obviously, the next step to that is to really accountability and verification. And there's a lot of work going on in this space. We'll have the future speaker talking about that impact verification process and benchmarking and other things, where does best benchmarking make sense, where it doesn't make sense. There are many places it doesn't make sense. And so we will talk about those as well. And last and most important to me is really the process of learning has to be with the real-time analytics. The technology and platform like SOCAP really has evolved into building very real-time analytics, which allows you to understand the impact in a very holistic fashion. And as I mentioned, sooner our skill becomes more real-time, collecting data very fast and real and very effective, better it is to create an intelligence and better it is to improve the scalability. So that's really my quick introduction to the topic. Again, as you can see how much passionate I am about this topic today. I'm very excited that Lindsay has graciously accepted this session, this topic, because this is going to be quite hands-on topic. And she will go through first introduction of 60 Decibel, and many of you, I'm assuming you already know them, but she will give a history about 60 Decibel, followed by step-by-step process on building effective survey altogether. So Lindsay, thank you so much for being our guest today and really participating in this series and advancing these conversations. I'm going to stop sharing the screen so that you can share your presentation. And again, guys, please feel free to share your questions and keep this session conversational.
Great. Thank you, Unmesh. This just like makes my day and my week to see this chat light up with folks from all over the world. As Unmesh mentioned, my previous 8 years was spent running SOCAP, which is a big global impact investing conference that brought about 3,000 people to San Francisco every year. And I wanted to just start with a little bit of a personal insight. So I am not an impact measurement professional. I can guarantee that there are hundreds of people on this call who have much more experience, many years of experience on me in this area. But if I look back at my career and even back to my childhood, the thread that sort of connects the very winding path that I've taken is that I am a people watcher. I am endlessly fascinated by people. As a kid, I had a staring problem. I was always getting in trouble for staring. It's why I loved living in New York City, because that city is just endless fascination. And it was what was so great about running SOCAP. You know, running a global event put me in touch with people from all over the world doing really impactful, meaningful work that was endlessly fascinating to sort of sit in the middle of and curate. But also for all of the attendees that came, it was so fascinating to me to just watch the way that people experience content and what worked for them, what didn't, what how much wisdom was actually in the crowd made me, you know, impress humility upon our presenters, because for all of you that are in this chat, there's so much wisdom that's already out there. And I think a big takeaway from this, hopefully, is that you all already have the skills and the tools that you need to do better in stakeholder listening. And that fascination with people is ultimately what led me to 60 decibels. 60 decibels is about listening better and really understanding the experience of the folks that you're working with and trying to serve. One of my favorite quotes is a Lilla Watson quote. She's an Aboriginal activist, and she says, if you've come here to help me, you're wasting your time. But if you've come because your liberation is tied up with mine, then let us work together. And that's something that I think of often in this work, is that it's there's too much time that's spent designing products and services without that being a collaborative process. And so I hope that's something that we all keep in this, and that it's really about a deep curiosity about people and about collaboration with sort of this global community. So the way that I want to spend the next 30 minutes or so is to first just give you a little background on 60 decibels, our approach and our experience in listening. Then I want to give a few sort of concrete case studies of ways that companies and investors or funders have used end customer level data to really drive decision making. And then dig into those sort of tips and tools to get you started listening. And we'll send out, I know there's always the question of, will the slides be shared? Will additional resources be shared? And I would say our general orientation is, let's make as much of this sort of open source and available so that you all have the tools to do it yourself. And so we'll send a whole bundle of resources and slides after the call. So if you sort of stick with me for the next 30 minutes, my hope is that at the end, you'll sort of understand that customer level data is really, really powerful, that the way that I share sort of the business insights that come from that will be motivational to you and whoever else you may need to influence to do this work. And that, you know, you'll get started. This isn't the hardest part of impact measurement. This is the fun part. So the fun part is getting a better sense of what's happening at the end of the line and really understanding that human experience. So while I pull up my slides, I would love to know if anyone else in the crowd, throw it in the chat, is a people watcher. What's your favorite place to people watch and be curious about strangers? So do that while I'm pulling this up. All right.
Oh my God, so many different answers.
Oh my gosh, airports, I know, they're so fun. Restaurants, yes, any sidewalk, so fun. Good, well, it looks like we've got a lot of people watchers on the call, so that's awesome. Okay, so who is 60 decibels and why is that our name? 60 decibels is the volume of a human conversation. And that's what we do, is we have human conversation. So our sole purpose is to listen better to end customers. And that is what we are obsessively focused on. How do we do that? Mostly through phone. So I often get asked when people go to our website or hear about 60 decibels, like, is it an app? What, you know, how is it a platform? What is it? At its most basic, we are picking up the phone and we are calling people human to human and having 15-minute phone conversations. What's pretty amazing is that since 60 decibels started 7-8 years ago inside of Acumen, we have built a global infrastructure of over 750 local researchers speaking local languages, making those phone calls. And we do that in a repeatable, standardized way. That means that we have really thoroughly tested question sets, and that those questions over and over again start to form a really powerful picture of what's happening, what's working, and form benchmarks for the sector. So I mentioned we started within Acumen. If you haven't heard of Acumen, they're a global impact investor focused on improving, working with the world's poor and improving their quality of life. They've been doing this for decades, and alongside the growth of the field of impact investing, we're really a leader in impact management, had built, partnered with groups to do software systems, had a team that was completely focused on understanding their impact, had very sophisticated global data, but ultimately 6 or 7 years ago looked around and said, what we really want to understand is this customer level impact. After decades of doing this work, we still don't know if we are serving the world's poor and making their lives better. And I think that's probably something that many of you can resonate with. This sort of typical impact metrics that we're collecting, whether it's for an impact investor, social enterprise, or an NGO or a foundation, any of the range of organizations you all are a part of, we're tracking metrics around activity, around output, maybe some basic demographic information. But the information that we really want to have is not the number of farmers that a company has reached, but are they better off? Not how many students are attending new schools, but are they learning more? And so if you really sort of push your model to say, what's all this data that we have, but what's that data gap? What's the insights that we still don't have to really understand how the product is working and if it's making people's lives better? What challenges are they still facing, etc. And that's important to understand because these are real people besides the state behind this data that's in these impact reports, and their voice matters. And so when we think about there being a human behind every data point, there's a ton of richness in that data that's being sort of left on the table. There's a lot of customer insight. And so this is going to drive your impact, drive a better business, and I hope it's something that you all will decide you want to jump into. The thing that's hard about this, the reason why we don't always call our customers or our end stakeholders, is that it's often perceived to be too costly or messy or just not knowing where to start. So when we started within Acumen, we tested a few different things: mobile, like text-based, online, some in-person, etc. And sort of the best combination of getting the qualitative insights that were needed, making it standard, repeatable, etc., and doing it at scale was to use phone. And so phone cuts through some challenges for hard to reach populations around literacy challenges, Wi-Fi access challenges. There's pretty good mobile penetration in most parts of the world right now. This doesn't have to be a smartphone. This is just any kind of phone. That may not be true in the context that you're working with. So, as you think about end stakeholder design, and you really have to start from there. Who are they? What is the best way to reach them? But the benefits of phone also, besides just access and reaching folks, are that you can have that depth of qualitative insight. So we have built this global network of over 750 researchers in 50 plus countries. They speak 125 plus languages. So we're kind of constantly recruiting for new projects and have a giant, infrastructure built around our researcher operations. My colleague Ashley is actually on the call, who runs our researcher operations. And so we're always recruiting and training. Actually, Michaela, I saw in the chat earlier, mentioned that Acumen has a great lean data course. And that's a course that we developed. So we were lean data within Acumen before we spun out as 60 Decibels. But again, trying to make these resources as accessible as possible. So take those courses if you're interested. There's lots of ways to collect this data that isn't big and heavy and burdensome and complex. So the sectors that we started in were largely the sectors that Acumen and our partners were most invested in. So we have a real depth of experience within off-grid energy, agriculture, financial inclusion, and education. But we're growing a body of work in lots of different sectors all the time. So excited to hear from folks on this call. I saw different chats, but we have sort of growing work that's with, for example, a refugee lens or a gender lens or an inclusion and disability lens. And so how can enterprises across all of these sectors also understand their impact relative to those, the folks that they may be serving, looking through those lenses. We've had the privilege to work with some really incredible and sophisticated clients who have big measurement and evaluation teams. But this is a complementary piece to what those teams have. Even folks who are already invested in RCTs, those can be multi-year process and have this big output at the end, whereas sort of our approach is more of this continuous listening that Unmesh mentioned, where you get quick feedback and it's very actionable and it's not quite as heavy. It may not have the statistical rigor to be published in an academic journal, but it has the rigor to be statistically relevant for your population and understand how you serve better the folks that you're trying to serve. We've also had the privilege of working with funds and enterprises that are just starting on their impact measurement journey. And this is a great place to start. I think this is the most essential thing to understand as you try to measure your impact is where the rubber meets the road. How is that landing with the folks that you're working with? So just a little more concrete, how does it work? We're usually conducting about 200 to 300 interviews with a customer base. So even if that customer base is 10,000, or if it is, 300 people, we'll sort of adjust the sample size, but that 200 typically gets us enough for a 90% confidence, mostly phone. We're doing in a 15-minute phone survey, which we try to keep it to 15 minutes for respecting people's time. We'll do a mix of open-ended and multiple choice. And as I mentioned, just a few open-ended questions can really add a depth of insight that is not available via, text-based surveys or even online surveys. I always use myself, I learned this at SOCAP, like, what's my behavior in that situation? If I think of myself first, we all get online surveys. I might answer the multiple choice questions. Any of those open-ended boxes that say, do you have anything else to tell me or to tell us? I skip it. I don't have time. I write good sentences. I'm just not going to do it. But on the phone, people will tell you what they think, or they'll say, oh gosh, I don't know why I like it. I guess it's because this and that. But those this and that's really add up over time, where you start to see it show up in multiple places and say, this is a real value driver, even if people aren't even able to articulate it very well. And so that richness of the phone conversations really comes through. And I'll just flag too, that 12-week time period. So usually these projects between survey design, data collection, analysis, all of that, if a client is also, just working on that timeline with us, we can get through this stuff in about 3 months and get really rich insights for folks to use in a variety of ways. Unmesh also mentioned, some of you may be thinking, gosh, I've already been on this impact measurement journey for a while, and I've been digging through IRIS, and I have looked through all the IMP resources, Impact Management Project. I've been trying to align to the SDG guidelines. I've looked at the impact verification principles. There are a lot of frameworks and tools out there. This is, customer listening is just the way you actually get that data. So there's nothing about it that's different from that or that detracts from any of those frameworks. This is the way that once you identify the IRIS metrics that you want to collect, that you can actually collect them. That once you understand sort of within the IMP what you're trying to do, who you're trying to impact, and then really measure how much impact are you having? What is your contribution? And so we have a set of questions, our core insights, that we've tested across all of those sectors that I mentioned. And they're key questions that sort of get at and are aligned to the impact management project, so that we can really all sort of align around these really important dimensions of impact that help us all sort of speak the same language, whether you're on the ground level working directly with communities, or you're 3 layers up at, you know, a big financial provider and trying to get clarity all the way through to the impact. So I'm going to transition here. That was sort of the intro to who we are, our singular focus on listening to end stakeholders, and our experience doing that. As we transition to this next part around case studies, I'd love to just see in the chat, hopefully that got your wheels turning a little bit, but who are the end customers that you all are seeking to listen to? So who is that end beneficiary? It could be employees. Like if your thesis is around quality jobs, it maybe in that case, it's not the actual thing that those workers are producing, but you want to understand if you're having an impact on your workers. It could be rural communities. It could be any number of folks, but just, you know, it could be mothers. It could be farmers. Let's get a sense of, yeah, hospitals, foster youth, students, frontline health workers. And you think about the powerful insights that these folks will have about the experience they're having. I love this. This like totally gets my juices flowing to see you all are doing such incredible work. Okay, cool. So how do we make this real? How do I give you a little more concrete? Like we do all this stuff at this huge scale, but what does that really mean? So here's an example. I'm going to talk through companies first. Companies are really able to increase their impact and their customer satisfaction with this data. So we worked with a group in Nigeria called Sultry International that helps farmers to source. It's basically a place where they can sell their cassava and process it into different, more marketable staples. So that farmer satisfaction, farmer experience is super important to them. And through a survey of their farmers, we found things that basically were things that they were already aware of, but that they didn't realize the extent to which these challenges were limiting the farmers' ability to improve their quality of life and build livelihoods. And so some of these really concrete insights were that the transportation of the cassava, which is very water-based and really heavy, was causing lots of problems because of the long distance they had to travel. They also were really frustrated because some of them would, you know, get their products to market and then have a delay in the payment. And so 2 actions that they were able to take from that, they set up mini processing plants that were sort of, you know, a closer distance, intermediary points to the end processing point so that they didn't have to travel as far. And they were also able to use the data from this end level study to take it to a bank and say, we really need this working capital loan, which was something they were having trouble securing from the Nigerian bank, and showing the ways that by having that working capital, they could smooth out the payments to the farmers, get payments to them more quickly, and really drive this better experience and improved outcomes. So I think that's it's going to decrease the farmers' costs. It's going to allow them to pay the farmers on time. And they were able to use it to just make some really concrete improvements to their product or service and to influence a debt financer to get themselves some additional capital. So one of the most valuable questions that we ask, and I think you'll all be able to see how this might have relevance to the work that you do. This is something that's like a very, I don't know, corporate business school type metric, the Net Promoter Score. I had never heard of it before business school, but it essentially just asks a very simple question. On a scale of 0 to 10, how likely are you to recommend this company to, or this product or this service to a friend or family member? and you take the folks who answer a 9 or 10, those are your promoters, and you subtract out anyone who gives it a 0 to a 6, who are really sort of your detractors. And then you don't really count the 7s or the 8s. Those are your passives, because they're probably not going to promote or detract. And that gets you your net promoter score. We ask this question across pretty much every project that we do in every sector in every country. And it is a really, really valuable, simple data point. And not only do we get the number that is very comparable, you'll see on the right here how it allows us to give them a comparison to, here's how you compare to other folks who work in agriculture on net promoter. Here's how you compare to other folks in your region. Here's how you compare to our global average on net promoter score. And so you're not just getting one data point, you're getting your data within the context of your peers and the global network. But then we also ask a follow-up open-ended question, which gives this much deeper insight about what people like, what challenges people are facing. It has a lot of concrete insights that allows companies to see, this is why people would recommend us. This is why they're not happy with us. And so even though we also ask questions around customer satisfaction, this one seems to really get at like that piece of, it's not about whether I like it or I don't like it. Would I recommend it to my friends? We're all sort of social beings. And when you understand how much people would or wouldn't, it's a really valuable. I've been impressed by this. That's why I'm spending so much time on it, is like, it's so comparable, and it's a really valuable metric for all of our companies. We ask a lot of other questions, the same across all of these sectors. I know that there's often this feeling that like impact measurement is so bespoke and it's really hard to compare across these different instances. But when you're asking these questions about end outcomes, you're often sort of skipping over, I mean, context still matters, but you're skipping over some of the specifics of how a product or service is delivered to really get at, who are you reaching? How much do they say it improved their quality of life? Do they have access to alternatives? These are questions that work in a wide variety of contexts and give you insights that you'll see all of these top ones align to the impact management project. So they show the who, the what, the how much. And so when we do this over and over again, it drives benchmarks. So we have financial inclusion data from working with 61 different financial inclusion companies in 22 countries. And this is real data. The human behind every data point is those 29,000 people who answered these questions. And what that tells us is that within financial inclusion as a sector, based on these companies, largely they're serving folks who 35% are living below the World Bank poverty line. 34% of them say that their quality of life is very much improved. But it's not just about those averages, it's also about the range of performance within the sector. And so knowing that some fintechs are reaching only 9% who live below the poverty line, they're actually targeting, you know, a more middle income population maybe, but some are reaching groups where 64% are below the poverty line. That's a big range. Unmesh, did you have?
No, go ahead. I'm just telling everybody to put the Q&A in Q&A section, not in the chat.
Yeah, and I apologize. I'm doing this all on one screen, so I'm having to like toggle between stuff. So I'm not totally seeing your questions right now. So Ashley is tracking them. We will get to all of them. She might even be answering some of them. Cool. So yeah, just wanted to say, like, I think that this piece of benchmarking is a powerful piece that I just did not understand before I joined this organization. I thought the power was in that individual, like, let's call people and ask if it's working. How can we do so much measurement without getting to that very basic question? But now I've understood the way that if we do that with rigor and with standardization and in a way that's comparable, it adds this much greater insight about performance and how we're performing relative to our peers that I think drives the whole sector, the whole industry to be better, to understand that there is a way to, you know, reach farther, create more impact, drive greater quality of life, etc. Okay, so now switching to, if you're an investor or a fund manager, a portfolio manager of philanthropy, whatever that may be. One of our longtime clients is Omidyar Network. And they recently sort of spun out their big global impact investing into a few different funds. So Flourish Ventures is their fintech fund, and they do work all over the world. During COVID, it was really important to them to support their portfolio companies by helping them understand what was going on with their customers. And so they brought us on to do a study in 5 different countries. So we worked in, I want to make sure I get this right. So we worked in Brazil, India, Indonesia, South Africa, and the United States to survey over 3,000 gig workers. And so these are folks that were hugely impacted by COVID. And we could do comparisons by country. This got really valuable data back to the companies on how to best serve their customers. And then Flourish was able to also use that to make this sort of very public good, which allowed them, they got on BBC News, they got on all of these local news channels with a really newsworthy piece around what's happening to gig workers during COVID that was generated a lot of attention and made it so that others within the financial sector were more aware of what these folks were going through and how to support them. So there's often, like at the fund level, there's often sort of this public facing view of, we have a clearer view of the issue, we have a clearer sense of how our companies are impacting that. And I think that's what we all try to include in impact reports, but it often, I think, falls a little flat where it sort of says, we have different KPIs from all of our portfolio companies, and here's the laundry list of data. It doesn't roll up into sort of a deeper understanding of, here's the collective impact that they're all having. And not to say that that activity data isn't valuable. It is super valuable. It's just not taking it all the way through to, and then what? That's sort of an external use of the data. An internal use of the data is that when we do some of these broader portfolio projects where we're working across companies that are very different sizes in very different regions, maybe some that are really truly serving highly marginalized populations and others that are serving more of a middle income, portfolios have a hard time thinking about their impact management. How do we sort of, we've made these like strategic trade-off choices on each of these, but how do we visualize that to understand our total portfolio? And so we can use this really comparable, similar data, apples to apples, even though you may have apple and orange companies, to create these sort of visualizations that allow a portfolio manager, investors, et cetera, to understand where these different companies fall in terms of the scale of their reach. In this case, like how inclusive, how far below the poverty line they're reaching, how the depth of their impact, all of these different dimensions. And I'll say I'm also really impressed. Like I said, I'm not an impact measurement professional, but the ways that our team finds to visualize this data is remarkable to me. So as much as my takeaway for all of you is that this is not rocket science, find someone who's good at data visualization if you want to make it public, because the actual listening is not hard, but this part seems hard to me. Okay, so those were a few examples of how this data is used for real decision making. I want, again, to jump into the chat and just, you've thought about who you want to listen better to. What is something that would be most valuable for you to learn? And really, I guess actually what I'd love for you to throw in the chat is, who needs to see this data? Who is this data useful to? And so in your case, is it that your investors need to see it? Is it that the people who design your products or services need to see it? Decision makers? Yep. Implementing partners. Right. Oftentimes these are like pretty complex systems. You're maybe sitting at the center, but you have a lot of different partners who hold different pieces, and sort of the way that this can create visibility for all of those partners. Yep. Yeah, someone flags not just what impact on customers, but what matters most to customers. So what actually does drive the most impact for them? Yep, local teams. Cool. Yeah, so just, think about this in your own context, that I think we always want to make sure that we're not just collecting data for data's sake, but that we're really thinking about that to drive decisions, and thinking in advance about who needs to see that data and what would be most useful for them to see. Okay, so how do we start listening? Moving out of my presentation. So as a follow-up to this, we will send this around. But at the beginning of COVID, we published a free 19-page guide on how to conduct research work remotely. I saw someone ping in there, I'd love to see how to train enumerators. We have a whole cheat sheet on that. I didn't include that in this presentation, but this is an incredible guide for thinking about what technology to use, how to train enumerators, tips for writing a good survey. It has sample question sets. And so really encourage you to take a look through that, because I'm just going to share a few pieces that I thought would be sort of most broadly applicable, but also for deeper questions about training researchers and enumerators. Like I said, we've trained 750 enumerators and actually more. So we have a lot of resources on that. So feel free to follow up with us for more advice or tips on that. So a few things, I'm not going to read this, we'll send these slides out afterwards, but I think just a few things to highlight here. Making it enjoyable and ethical. This is really important. Like I said before, put yourself first, as a example, like, would I answer these questions? How would I want to be contacted? And I think some really basic things around how we contact folks. We've put a lot of thought into how to increase response rates. And so, a message letting people know you're going to be contacting them, maybe even letting them know what number you're going to be contacting them from. Just things that help cut through all of the noise that people are exposed to. Thinking about, as I mentioned, making sure it's decision focused. So don't just collect data for data's sake. Make sure that, if you're going to try to get it short, as we say here, a 15-minute survey, how can you get the most out of that survey by cutting out things that maybe, won't produce you meaningful data? What is most important for you to understand from this, and go deep on that versus the kitchen sink of potential questions that you can add in there. Make sure that you test the questions. And so we always do a small pilot with just a few folks, and with a real attention to, were any of these questions hard for the respondent to understand? One of our colleagues always says, you can't have a survey that creates brain pain. If the respondent or the enumerator has to think about the question or understand what it's really trying to ask, not a great question. Simplify it. And so there's lots of tips like this within here that make sense once you read them, but they're just important ones to keep in mind. I'm wrapping up here. So also, I just want you to think about those questions so we make sure we have time to get to some of them. We give some examples of question sets in the toolkit. And so understanding, if you think of these different pieces here and you take a look at these questions, do you know the answers to those questions? Maybe you do. I think, what we reveal often through these is things that you do already know, but that helps you, acquire that third-party data, changes the priority, or helps make a decision about which thing to prioritize first. It just gives greater nuance to a challenge that customers are facing, et cetera. So we have examples of each, broader 4 to 5 question sets of each of these in there, but obviously we have hundreds of survey modules. So also, again, reach out if you're trying to develop questions around other areas. And then just highlighting that, like, the stakeholders that this data is useful for, thank you all for chiming in the chat, but we see this like really quick uptake with product or service design. So there's almost always some operational insights. There's definitely marketing insights. We generally deliver some like public facing social media, quick tweets and things like that of the data, because it's just so valuable to be able to tell this story of your customers. It's a way that you can, it may just be that you don't need to change the product or service, but there's some little flaw or kink in the customer service, some way that people are experiencing you. And so how can you make those quick fixes? I can't understate how valuable this is for investor data, for bringing new capital in, et cetera. And something that I've heard more about recently from some folks is just this sort of license to operate. So especially in challenging environments where you may need to get government buy-in or other stakeholders that are, your work is critical to have their support. This data is really helpful for just painting the picture of why it's so important for you to do what you do. And so there's a lot of different really applicable uses here. Identify new markets, motivations, etc. Here's an example. So there's 5 of these in that toolkit that go into those different question sets. But I think the point in showing you this is just, it's not rocket science. Like, why did you buy it? How is the value for money? Like, these are questions that you've all been asked on surveys before that that get at this. Some things don't need an open-ended response. So think about where it makes sense to include something that's on a scale, so you can get sort of that understanding of how much people value something or how great their challenge is, et cetera. And then ask the open-ended questions where you really don't know. And sometimes, the test or a smaller pilot can be a great place to ask an open-ended question about, why do you see the greatest value? And then it turns out that there's 4 or 5 things that show up pretty consistently. In future surveys, those can be buckets with an other to sort of streamline the process. And so you can use those open-ended ones strategically to sort of do discovery and then streamline your surveys going forward with more multiple choice. So I'm going to wrap up where I used my time for sure, and want to open up the questions here. I'm also going to pop to, so, and I'll just say, in closing up, the thing that I mostly want to leave you with here is how valuable this data is and how much insight it can provide to your business. That there's a lot that's being left on the table, and apologies, I keep using the term business, but it could be, your program, your idea, your organization, whatever that might be. Don't leave this data on the table. There's really, it's the most valuable data to understand the impact you're having, and you'll get data on your customer, on your business, and on your impact. And so I really just want to encourage you to get started. Okay, so I'm off screen share. I'm pulling up Q&A.
And thank you, Lindsay, for wonderful presentation. I think, as many of you can see, the topic of stakeholder data and stakeholder listening is fairly complex and requires you to understand multi-dimensional aspect of data, who the data is useful for, what should you do in listening, how should you align it with different dimensions. So hopefully this was a primer, not necessarily the in-depth primer, but a very high-level primer, which is very useful to find the resources all your way through. I'm going to invite Lorena to choose some of the questions, because there are quite a few sections.
Yeah, Unmesh, I see a few in the Q&A here that are all great ones to answer. So one here around, how do you balance and address bias in self-reported data? I think, there is bias in responses. The 2 things, we always look at representative data. So as much as you may have sort of basic data on your population, make sure that the population that you're surveying matches those demographics. And you can also, there's online tools that can kind of calculate representativeness and statistical significance. So how many folks do you need to survey to get to a representative sample? Our feeling on self-reported data is that on most things, there is kind of no better judge of the answer of these impacts than the people themselves. So if someone's asking, how much did this improve your quality of life? Whatever that person's answer is, that's their answer. And it's their perceived quality of life. So perception is actually really valuable, even if perception may be biased. And then also, is the bias so great that it means there's not valuable insights in there for your business. So if, you know, there's some bias, like you get overweighted a little bit, people who say that this is a challenge, it's still probably a pretty pervasive challenge in your business. So whether it shows up as 60%, but it's actually 50%, it should still sort of, you know, give you that meaningful data that you need. Someone asked, what's the number of questions we should put in a survey that you email out? I would say our experience with online is that the response rate is just significantly lower. So you want to make sure it is a population that gets online, make sure it's coming from someone that they would recognize, really explain the purpose of the survey up front, so that they understand why they're answering those questions, and then keep it short and use more multiple choice. So I wouldn't include more than like 2 open-ended questions in an online survey, because it will mean that people drop off. And when you test, just look for where there's that drop off. We also use like more engaging formats like Typeform that just tend to keep people more invested in moving through the survey. So some of those newer survey tools are good as well. Within the phone surveys, we can usually fit about 35 to 40 questions within a 15-minute phone survey. Less if it's more open-ended, more, you know, usually not more than 40 questions anyway. Another question on increasing response rate. So for phone, our response rates internationally are around 60%, and in the US around 35%. And that's shocking to me because I never answer my phone. But the things that we do to improve those numbers are, one, we have the partner send out a message explaining why they're having this third party do a survey. We send them a text saying that we're going to be calling you within the next 2 days. Sometimes we'll even let them know the number that we'll be calling from, or use a tool that makes it so it shows up that 60 decibels is calling. We all know that like unknown numbers often get screened. And then we'll try folks 3 times. Usually that's sort of our standard, is that we repeatedly call and sometimes even allow them to select the time that they want us to give them a call back. Let's see, other questions coming in. How can you measure the value of the data you collect to third parties? I mean, you could survey them. I'm not sure I'm understanding that question correctly, but yeah, Alex, maybe we can follow up on that separately. Let's see, let me screen through these. Where record responses where technology penetration such as Wi-Fi is limited. So as I said, we're just using simple phone for most of these. And then our enumerators are trained to record qualitative responses verbatim. And so they're capturing those responses, maybe doing it quickly in the moment and then going back and cleaning it up. But then those qualitative responses are coded. And so because we do this at such a huge scale, we use Qualtrics, but there's, you know, more simple tools that you can use to just quickly, you know, pre-populate your multi-select and answer those as you go through. So it's, you know, ultimately it's phone. We generally don't record the phone calls, but sometimes we do if we really need like transcription or something like that. Small social enterprise who doesn't have the resources to hire outside consultants, impact management software tools you would recommend. I think, Unmesh, that might be in your category a little bit more, but I will say that there's sort of a pain point within the industry overall as far as these tools, and a lot of folks are still using Excel to keep track of all their social impact data. That's not a great solution, but I'm just more saying that so that if you don't have one, you don't feel like there's nowhere for you to start. But there is a growing set of tools. So I think SOPACT is actually a great resource for that. Let's see, what else do we have here? So for, you know, family foundations looking to collect information on the impact of the grants that they provide, I think, you know, there is a version of a survey where you're surveying grantees, but I think potentially more valuable is if you think all the way through that maybe it's the mission of the foundation to support the grantee organizations. But it's more likely, I think, that the mission of the foundation is to understand the impact all the way through to whoever those organizations support. And so this often, for the foundations that work with us, this is sort of like a gift that they give to the organizations that they work with, is to support them in doing this customer level feedback. Because what it does is it gives the organization better data on their programming, their services, etc. But it also gives data back to the foundation so that they can understand the impact that their grantees are having. So I think there's a lot of sensitivity by foundations to not be a burden on their grantees. But at least the way that we do this is that, we make it as outsourced as possible. So we get initial input from them on what they most need to learn, and, insight from the funder about what's most important to understand from an impact standpoint. And then they don't have to touch it. I think there's other approaches that are around like really building that continuous listening strength within the client-facing organization. That's great too. But other organizations are going to be focused on delivering the product or service they deliver. And so this strength is like something that, like having an outsourced accountant or whatever, like you don't necessarily need an accounting professional in your organization. You can hire for outside listening. And sometimes that's a great benefit that a foundation or investor can offer to their portfolio. Anyone want to pull out any other ones, Ashley, that you've seen that I should make sure I answer here? On how frequently to measure or assess your beneficiaries. That's a great question. So, I think ideally you do this annually. In practice, we see that it's not quite that frequent. A year goes by really quickly. And in other cases, like in COVID, there were projects where we were listening monthly. So I think it really depends on like, are there changes that you expect to see over a certain amount of time? How do you place the survey so that you're really understanding that? And just how do you keep a rapport with your customers? So oftentimes when a project is most driven by that decision making is when there is sort of a fork in the road for an organization, or they're facing some sort of like recurring obstacle in terms of breaking through to a next level of, business growth or things like that. And that customer insight is really important. So I think with some of our long-term clients who use us across, for example, an entire portfolio, they often, as they bring portfolios in, will do sort of like a baseline to understand what they're working with. And then at those different decision-making points, they'll bring us on to do, more of a deep dive sort of customized survey with them, and then doing something that's, maybe understanding impact a few years in. Hopefully that's helpful, but I think it depends on the method. You also don't want to overserve your customers. Ashley, anything you want to add on how to measure awareness?
Sure. Yeah. So I was looking at that. I think it depends on, are you looking at like market awareness in general, in which case maybe relying on panels from companies such as, bigger market research companies. Generally in our surveys, what we do is we just ask, about acquisition channel and how a customer heard about a product or service, and that helps us understand different ways to increase uptake. And so we'll also ask, sometimes around awareness of other types of products, but again, I would say reach out to us separately and we can see if we have more specific advice to give. And then Lindsay, there was a question around whether we look at market systems from Jane that I thought maybe you could tackle.
Yeah, and Jane, I want to make sure I understand that question, but I think because we're understanding at these different layers, so we're understanding from customers, what is most important to them. So there's that layer. we're helping companies understand what about their product or service is working or not working. And because we're doing that across so many different companies within a sector, we're able to better understand that sector, because we can see where, for example, in our off-grid energy report, you can see that solar lanterns are reaching the poorest of the poor, but that home solar systems have the greatest impact on quality of life. And so you can start to understand the dynamics of the off-grid energy sector because you're asking these comparable questions across different subsectors and understanding how these different business models, different products actually have different types of impact. And then, you know, for the funders, then they're also looking across sectors. So they're able to see that, you know, their financial inclusion portfolio is actually having greater impact in terms of, you know, the impact that they're seeking with customers, but their agriculture portfolio is reaching much farther below the poverty line in places where there is no access to alternatives. So I think as far as market systems, it's still, for us, it's often starting within these sort of nested pieces of like where capital is flowing and where there's products and services being delivered. But because we're working across so many different ones, we start to get that more market level view. Standard survey set in use to understand the health and social care needs of beneficiaries accessing support. So we have done, and so, you know, yes, there are standards. So there's our core insights, which I think those same questions around access to alternatives, improvement on quality of life, those things really apply for the most part across sectors. And then when we have done work in health, we have the way that we sort of organize our survey question bank is in survey modules. So within each sector, then we have some sort of tested question sets that dig deeper into quality of care or beneficiary needs or things like that. So there are some tested question sets and would be happy to talk more about that. Better or more widely accepted tools than others to measure personal qualitative metrics, empathy, self-efficacy, reduced anxiety, etc. Those are ones that there's some great research out there more in the academic field around some of these things. And we're always, you know, when we start a project in an area that we haven't done 200 projects in, we're always going out to the field to really understand what the current best research is. We did a great project this year during COVID that was like, we inserted a lot of questions around bridging and bonding. So this sort of like relationship-based trust. Who do people trust within their networks? How do they build new relationships of trust? And that was built off a lot of sociological research and just designing and testing those questions. So always look, you know, if you're within a field, look for what research is out there. And then sometimes you can even find, like if you dig in the footnotes, you can see the actual survey that was used to get at some of this research and use those questions. You know, they're out there and they've been tested. Obviously, make sure you also test it with your population to make sure that they make sense. We're doing another set of projects right now that are around understanding human flourishing. And so, you know, this is the fun part of our work, that there's all different types of questions to ask and all different impacts that people have organized their business or their funding around. And usually there's a way to ask questions to get at that. All right.
Looks like we're running to the answer most of the question. That's a marathon. That's complete. That's fantastic. And it's amazing to see 200 people still have hung on. So which is, I'm sure you found this topic very useful and fascinating. Otherwise you wouldn't be here. Again, thank you, Ashley. Thank you, Lindsay. This is an amazing introduction to stakeholder, and I'm sure everybody found this thing to be very collaborative and useful.